The night I collapsed on the kitchen floor, the house was full, yet I had never felt so invisible. I remember the clock blinking 2:17 in harsh red numbers, the refrigerator humming like it was annoyed at me for breathing too loudly, and my phone lying face down on the table where I had placed it earlier, just in case. I had texted my children that I was feeling unwell. Nothing dramatic, just the truth. I thought honesty would be enough. I was wrong. When I woke up hours later on the cold tiles, my cheek pressed against the floor, my body trembling in a way I had never known before, I realized something had already changed, even before the sickness had a name. For 40 years, I had been the one who answered first. Late-night calls, broken cars, empty refrigerators, tearful confessions whispered into my shoulder. I was the mother who fixed, smoothed, paid, forgave. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that this created a kind of insurance, a quiet promise that when it was my turn to be weak, someone would show up. That belief stayed with me as the ambulance lights washed the walls blue and white. As the paramedic asked me questions I struggled to answer, as I signed my own consent forms with a shaking hand. I still believed it when the doctor said the word chronic and paused, watching my face carefully, as if expecting me to bargain. At first, my children came. They brought flowers that wilted quickly in the hospital air and spoke in cheerful tones that didn't quite reach their eyes. They asked practical questions about insurance and schedules, about how long this would last, about whether I would need help. I mistook their efficiency for care. I told them not to worry, that I would manage, that I just needed a little time. Mothers learn early how to make themselves smaller, how to soften the truth so it doesn't inconvenience others. I was very good at it. The visits became shorter, the calls less frequent. My illness did not improve fast enough to hold their attention. It had the audacity to linger. I was discharged with a folder full of instructions and a body that no longer trusted itself. At home, the silence felt different, heavier. The house seemed to wait, as if even the walls were unsure what would happen next. I sat in my old armchair, the one near the window, and listened to the quiet, thinking someone would break it. No one did. I learned the sound of being forgotten. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives in missed calls that go unanswered, in messages marked read with no reply, in promises to visit that dissolve into vague apologies. My children were busy. They had lives. They had families. I told myself this again and again, as if repetition could turn it into comfort. But sickness strips you of many illusions, and one of them is the idea that love alone creates obligation. There were days when getting out of bed felt like negotiating with gravity. On those days, I would look at my phone and wonder how much pain justif. IED asking for help. I rationed my needs carefully. A glass of water became optional, a warm meal, a luxury. I learned to move slowly, deliberately, so I would not fall. I learned that dignity can become a cage when you are afraid of being a burden. I told myself I was strong. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself many things. The first time I asked directly, my voice sounded strange to my own ears. I told my eldest that I needed help getting groceries. There was a pause on the line, a small one, but enough. He sighed, not cruelly, just tiredly, and said he would try. He did not come. Later, he sent a message saying something had come up. I replied with a heart emoji, the universal symbol of pretending everything is fine. Weeks passed. My world shrank to the distance between the bedroom and the kitchen. The calendar pages turned without ceremony. I stopped mentioning my symptoms. I stopped explaining how hard it was. Silence, I discovered, is contagious. If you offer it often enough, people accept it gratefully. My children began to speak to me as if I were already a problem solved, something placed neatly out of sight. When they did call, it was brief, transactional, almost relieved when the conversation ended. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, sunlight slanting across the floor, that I understood I had been abandoned not with anger, but with indifference. That realization was colder than any diagnosis. Anger at least acknowledges your existence. Indifference erases it. I sat there holding my phone, feeling a strange calm settle over me. If this was how it was going to be, then I needed to stop waiting. Waiting was costing me more than energy. It was costing me clarity. That was when the phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. I had learned not to expect much from ringing phones, but something in me, perhaps habit, perhaps instinct, lifted my hand. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and used my full name. He said he was a lawyer and asked if this was a good time to talk. I looked around the empty room and realized suddenly that it was the perfect time. He didn't rush his words, and that alone made me sit up straighter. He said he was calling regarding my estate file, something that had been dormant for years, something I had almost forgotten I set in motion back when my health felt permanent. I told him I was ill, that this wasn't a good time, and he surprised me by saying he already knew. Not the details, not the diagnosis, just the fact that something had changed. Lawyers, I would learn, notice changes before families do. They are trained to listen for silence. He asked if I was safe, if I was alone, if anyone had power of attorney. Each question landed gently but firmly, like a hand testing a weak railing. I answered honestly. Yes, I was alone. No one had power of attorney. I had planned to update things when life slowed down. Life, it turned out, does not wait for permission. He told me he wanted to come by, just to review documents, just to make sure everything reflected my current wishes. I agreed, mostly because it felt good that someone was taking my situation seriously without asking me to apologize for it. After we hung up, I sat very still. The room felt different, as if it had overheard the conversation and was holding its breath. I realized how little anyone had asked me what I wanted lately. My children had asked what I needed occasionally, but always in a way that assumed the answer would be minimal. No one had asked about my wishes, my plans, my fears. The lawyer's questions lingered, rearranging something inside me. For the first time since I got sick, I felt a thin line of anticipation instead of dread. He arrived 2 days later, precisely on time. He wore a neutral suit and carried a slim folder, nothing dramatic. He greeted me by name, looked me in the eye, and waited for me to sit before he did. Small things, but they mattered. We went through paperwork, slowly. He explained, not condescendingly, but clearly. He asked if my children were involved in my care. I told him the truth without embellishment. He nodded once, as if this fit a pattern he had seen before. We talked about my will, about beneficiaries, about contingencies I had never considered. He asked what would happen if I became unable to make decisions temporarily. I laughed softly at the word temporarily, then stopped. He noticed. He did not fill the silence. Eventually, I said I wanted things to be fair. He asked what fair meant to me. No one had asked me that in years. I found myself answering more fully than I intended. At one point, he asked if my children knew the current structure of my assets. I shook my head. I had always assumed transparency was kindness, but now I wasn't sure. He said something then that stayed with me. He said clarity is kinder than assumption. Documents prevent misunderstandings from becoming resentments. I thought of my children, of how often I had filled in gaps for them, paid quietly, fixed silently. I wondered what assumptions I had trained them to make. When he left, the house did not fall back into silence the way it usually did. It felt occupied by thought. That evening, my phone buzzed, a message from my youngest asking how I was. The timing was almost funny. I replied politely, briefly. I did not volunteer details. I was beginning to understand the power of restraint. Sickness had taken many things from me, but it had given me an unexpected discipline. I no longer spent energy cushioning other people from reality. The next week, the lawyer called again. He said he had sent notices, routine ones, just confirming records, making sure everything was in order. He mentioned my children might be contacted if they were listed anywhere as emergency contacts or informal references. I said that was fine. My voice did not shake. I surprised myself. He said something about timelines, about follow-ups. I listened carefully. There is a strange comfort in procedure. It creates rails where emotions would otherwise spill everywhere. It did not take long. The first call came from my eldest, his voice sharper than usual. He asked why a lawyer had called him, why questions were being asked, whether something was wrong. I told him I was sick. He already knew that. I told him I was reviewing my affairs. That seemed to alarm him more. He asked why now. I said because now is when things matter. There was a pause, longer than before. I waited. He did not like that I waited. Soon after, another child called, then another. Their concern arrived suddenly, densely packed, full of urgency that had been absent for months. They wanted updates, details, reassurances. They wanted to come by. They wanted to talk. I listened to them with a calm I did not recognize as my own. I realized the lawyer had not just called about documents. He had rung a bell they could not ignore. That night, lying in bed, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness, not triumph, something steadier, the knowledge that I was no longer invisible, not because I had demanded attention, but because I had stopped making myself disappear. The lawyer would call again, I knew, and when he did, things would continue to shift. For the first time, I was not afraid of that movement. I closed my eyes, breathing slowly, and let the quiet work in my favor. The visits resumed quickly, almost too quickly, as if someone had flipped a switch. My children came in pairs at first, then individually, each one bringing a different version of concern. One brought soup I could not eat, another brought unsolicited advice wrapped in urgency. They sat on the edge of chairs, glancing around the house as if seeing it for the first time, noticing details that had always been there but had never mattered to them before. I watched them quietly, learning more from what they avoided than from what they said. They asked about the lawyer, casually at first, then more directly. I answered in the same tone, calm, factual, brief. I said I was putting things in order. I said it was routine. I said I wanted clarity. That word seemed to unsettle them. Clarity has a way of exposing what ambiguity has protected. One of them laughed nervously and said I was being dramatic. I smiled, because for once, I wasn't. I was being precise. In the past, I would have rushed to reassure them, to tell them nothing would change, that they didn't need to worry. This time, I let the silence sit. I noticed how uncomfortable it made them. Silence, when you stop apologizing for it, becomes a mirror. They filled it with questions about doctors, treatments, timelines. I answered what I wished to answer. I did not volunteer the rest. The illness had taught me that information, like energy, must be conserved. The lawyer called again to confirm an appointment. He said he wanted to go over some final details, that it would be helpful if I had thought about contingencies. I thanked him and said I had. I meant it. In the quiet hours between visits, I had done nothing but think. I had thought about the years I spent being the safety net, the unspoken guarantee. I had thought about how rarely anyone asked what that cost me. I had thought about the difference between love and expectation and how easily one is mistaken for the other. When the day came, my children insisted on being present. They framed it as support. I recognized it as anxiety. I allowed them to sit in, not because I needed them there, but because I wanted them to hear the same words I was hearing. The lawyer greeted them politely, professionally. He did not flatter them. He did not defer. He addressed me. That alone shifted the room. He reviewed documents out loud, explaining each clause carefully. He spoke about assets, about distributions, about conditions. When he mentioned that certain decisions would remain solely mine, unless legally transferred, I saw my eldest stiffen. When he explained that medical decisions required explicit authority, not assumption, I felt a strange relief. The rules were being named. What had always been implied was now written down. Questions came. My children asked them quickly, overlapping, trying to sound reasonable while betraying urgency. The lawyer answered patiently, redirecting each answer back to me. He said, "That will be up to your mother," more times than I could count. Each repetition settled something in my spine. I had not realized how long it had been since someone publicly acknowledged my agency without qualification. After the meeting, they lingered. They wanted to talk privately. I said I was tired. I was, but not in the way they thought. I was tired of emotional negotiations disguised as care. They hugged me carefully, as if unsure of the rules. I let them. Physical affection, I had learned, is easiest when words fail, but I did not let it distract me from the shift that had occurred. Something had been rebalanced, and they felt it too. The next few days were marked by frequent check-ins, messages, calls, offers to help that were suddenly specific, groceries, rides, appointments. I accepted some, I declined others. Each decision felt deliberate, like placing a stone in a garden. I was no longer building out of guilt or fear, but intention. My children were adjusting to a version of me they had not expected, one who did not rush to smooth their discomfort. The illness did not disappear. Pain still arrived unannounced. Fatigue still shaped my days, but something internal had stabilized. I had stopped confusing neglect with normalcy. I had stopped telling myself that being needed was the same as being valued. When the lawyer called to say everything was now updated and secure, I thanked him sincerely. He said something then quietly that surprised me. He said I had done well to act when I did. Many people wait too long. I understood what he meant. That evening, I sat alone, watching the light change outside the window. My phone lay beside me, silent for once. I did not feel lonely. I felt anchored. Whatever happened next, whatever my health decided, I knew I had restored something essential. Not control over others, but control over my own narrative. And that, I realized, was the beginning of something far more lasting than fear. The shift didn't announce itself with an argument or a dramatic confrontation. It settled in quietly, like furniture rearranged while you were asleep. My children still came, still called, but their tone had changed. There was a carefulness now, a subtle recalibration. They asked before assuming. They waited for answers instead of filling the space themselves. I noticed how often they mentioned the future, how often they framed their concern around what might happen rather than what was happening now. Fear does that. It pulls people forward in time when they don't want to look closely at the present. One afternoon, my eldest stayed behind after the others left. He lingered near the door, keys in hand, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He said he was worried about me being alone. I told him I understood. He asked if I had considered moving in with one of them. The suggestion was wrapped in care, but underneath it was something else. I felt it immediately. I told him I was comfortable where I was. I said my home was familiar. That routine mattered. He pressed gently at first, then more insistently. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said no. Just that. No explanation. The word felt solid in my mouth. He looked surprised, then frustrated. He asked if this was because of the lawyer. I said it was because of me. There was a long pause. He nodded once, sharply, as if accepting a rule he didn't like but couldn't argue with. When he left, I felt a flicker of guilt rise, old and practiced. I let it pass without feeding it. Guilt, I had learned, thrives on attention. My health fluctuated. Some mornings were manageable. Others required patience and a chair in the shower. On the harder days, I noticed how my children hovered, offering help that was both real and rehearsed. They wanted to be seen helping. I accepted assistance when it was useful. I declined when it wasn't. Each boundary was small, but together they formed a structure that supported me instead of draining me. I was no longer performing resilience for their comfort. The lawyer sent a follow-up email outlining emergency procedures, contacts, contingencies. It was thorough, unemotional, clear. I printed it and placed it in a folder by the door. The act felt grounding. Paper does not waver. It does not reinterpret itself based on mood. I found comfort in that certainty. For years I had relied on people's goodwill. Now I relied on systems. The calls from my children began to include more questions about my past, about decisions I had made, about why I had structured things the way I had. There was curiosity there, but also calculation. I answered honestly, but not exhaustively. I realized they were learning something too, that I was not simply reacting to illness, but responding to a lifetime of patterns. Illness had only accelerated the clarity. One evening, my youngest called in tears. She said she felt guilty for not being around more earlier. She said she hadn't realized how bad things were. I listened. I told her I believed her. I told her guilt was not necessary, but responsibility was. She asked what she could do now. I said she could show up consistently without expectation. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she would try. That word try was honest. I appreciated that more than promises. There were moments of tension, comments made sideways, jokes that missed their mark, attempts to regain the old dynamic where I reassured, excused, absorbed. Each time I gently redirected. I did not scold. I did not explain. I simply did not participate. Over time, the attempts lessened. People adjust to the rules they cannot bend. One afternoon, as I sorted through old photographs, I realized how much of my life had been spent buffering others from discomfort. I had mistaken that role for love. Looking back, I saw how often my needs had been postponed indefinitely. The illness had stripped away the illusion that there would always be time later. Later is not guaranteed. That realization did not make me bitter. It made me focused. The lawyer called one final time to confirm everything was settled. He said there would be no further action unless I requested it. I thanked him. After we hung up, I sat quietly, letting the finality of it settle. I had done what I needed to do. The rest was living in whatever shape that took. That night, I slept deeply. Not because I was pain-free, but because my mind was no longer racing ahead, trying to anticipate neglect or manage disappointment. I had accepted what was without surrendering what mattered. In the morning, I would wake up sick, yes, but also steady. And that steadiness, I knew, would carry me through whatever came next. There was a morning when I woke up and realized I had stopped checking my phone first. The habit had been ingrained for so long that its absence felt noticeable. For months, I had reached for the screen as soon as I opened my eyes, bracing myself for disappointment, scanning for missed calls, for signs that someone had remembered me overnight. That morning, I noticed the light on the wall instead, the way it softened the room, the quiet hum of the house waking up with me. It was a small thing, but it marked a shift I hadn't planned. My attention had returned to my own life. My children still contacted me, but now there was a rhythm to it, predictable, manageable. They no longer called in a panic or with forced cheer. They asked how I was and waited for the answer. When I said I was tired, they didn't rush to contradict me with optimism. They accepted it. That accept. Ants mattered more than any dramatic gesture. It told me they were finally listening instead of reacting. One afternoon, my eldest asked if we could talk about the future again. His voice was cautious, careful not to push. I agreed. We sat at the table, the same one where I had paid bills and written birthday cards for decades. He asked what I wanted if my condition worsened. The question was hard, but it was also respectful. I told him I wanted comfort, clarity, and autonomy for as long as possible. I told him I didn't want decisions made in whispers or guilt-driven rushes. He nodded. He didn't argue. I saw then that fear had softened him. Fear can do that when it's no longer masked by entitlement. There were still moments when old habits surfaced, a suggestion phrased as an expectation, an assumption slipped into conversation. Each time I corrected it gently. I'll decide that, or that doesn't work for me. The words came easier now. They no longer felt like defenses. They felt like statements of fact. My children adjusted faster than I expected. It turns out people often respect boundaries they once ignored, as long as those boundaries are consistent. The illness continued its unpredictable course. Some weeks were easier. Others required more rest, more patience. I arranged my days around what my body could do instead of what others expected. I stopped apologizing for canceled plans. I stopped explaining my fatigue. I simply stated it. This too was a boundary. My children learned to accept it. The world did not end when I said no. The The lawyer's presence faded into the background, as it should. His work was done. The systems he helped put in place held quietly, without drama. I thought often about how strange it was that a stranger had shown me more consideration in those early weeks than my own family had. Not because he cared more, but because his role required him to. Structure had stepped in where emotion had failed. That realization stayed with me, not as resentment, but as clarity. One evening, my youngest brought dinner. She didn't announce it ahead of time or make it a production. She simply arrived, asked if I was up for company, and cooked quietly while we talked about ordinary things. When she left, she cleaned the kitchen without being asked. There was no performance in it, just presence. That, I realized, was what I had been missing. Not grand gestures, but reliability. As my strength fluctuated, I began sorting through my belongings, not in a morbid way, but with intention. I gave things away while I could explain their meaning. I labeled boxes. I wrote notes. This was not about preparing for death. It was about easing life. My children noticed. They asked questions. Second ring. He came without complaint. He stayed until the worst passed. He did not lecture or hover. He simply helped. After he left, I cried. Not from relief, but from the quiet recognition that things had changed for the better, not perfectly, but meaningfully. I understood then that abandonment had not been a single act. It had been a slow erosion, enabled by my silence and their distance. Reclaiming myself had not required confrontation or punishment. It had required clarity, consistency, and the willingness to let discomfort exist without rushing to fix it. My children were learning that lesson alongside me. That night, as I prepared for sleep, I felt tired in a way that was honest, not heavy. I knew there would be more challenges ahead. Illness does not negotiate, but I also knew I would meet them from a place of steadiness, not desperation. I turned off the light, listening to the house settle, and felt something rare and precious. Peace, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer waiting to be chosen. There was a quiet confidence that began to follow me through my days, subtle but steady. It showed up in small decisions, like choosing when to rest instead of pushing through pain to meet an unspoken expectation. It showed up when my children called and I let the phone ring until I was ready to answer, not because I wanted to teach a lesson, but because my energy mattered now. I noticed how this shift changed the way they spoke to me. They waited, they adjusted, they learned. One afternoon, my eldest asked if he could bring his children over. He said he wanted them to spend more time with me. The request was gentle, respectful. I agreed, but I set a time limit, just a few hours. He accepted without protest. When they arrived, the house filled with noise and laughter, and for a while it felt like the old days. But when my body signaled it had enough, I said so. We said our goodbyes earlier than planned. No one argued. No one looked disappointed. That acceptance felt like progress. My health forced me to live honestly. There was no room left for pretending. On days when I felt strong, I enjoyed it fully. On days when I didn't, I allowed myself rest without guilt. This honesty extended to my conversations. I no longer softened truths to protect others from discomfort. When my children asked how I was, I told them. Sometimes the answer was hopeful, sometimes it wasn't. They learned to hold both without rushing me toward reassurance. The lawyer's documents sat quietly in their folder, rarely opened but always present. Knowing they were there changed how I moved through the world. There was a safety net beneath my decisions now, one built from clarity instead of assumption. I realized how much of my anxiety before had come from uncertainty, from the fear that if I faltered, everything would unravel. That fear had eased. Systems do that. They hold when people hesitate. There was a moment sitting alone with a cup of tea when I thought about how close I had come to disappearing quietly. Not physically, but as a person with agency. I had been on the brink of becoming a story told by others, filtered through their interpretations. The illness had threatened to reduce me to a problem to be managed. Instead, it had forced me to assert myself. I did not choose the sickness, but I chose my response. My children began to share more of their lives with me, not in the frantic way they had when fear first struck, but in a measured, respectful way. They asked for advice. Sometimes I gave it, sometimes I declined. I told them when I didn't know. That honesty seemed to relax them. They were no longer looking to me for constant solutions. They were beginning to see me as a person, not just a resource. There were setbacks. Old tensions resurfaced under stress. One of my children accused me once of becoming distant. The comment stung. I took a breath before responding. I told him I hadn't become distant. I had become clear. There was a difference. He didn't answer right away. Later, he apologized. It wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. That was enough. As weeks passed, my world felt more manageable. Smaller, perhaps, but more mine. I spent time reading, sitting by the window, writing notes to myself about what mattered. I wrote letters I might never send, not out of bitterness, but to articulate truths I had swallowed for years. Writing them felt like reclaiming lost ground. I was no longer editing myself out of my own story. One evening, my youngest stayed late. We talked about her childhood, about moments she remembered differently than I did. We laughed. We disagreed gently. There was space for complexity. She told me she hadn't realized how much I had carried alone. I told her I hadn't let anyone see it. Responsibility, I was learning, is shared. So is accountability. When she left, I felt tired but content. I understood now that my children's abandonment had not been a single failure, but a consequence of patterns we had all participated in. Breaking those patterns had required discomfort, clarity, and outside intervention. The lawyer had been the catalyst, but the real work had been internal. That night, I slept without dreams, the kind of sleep that comes when your mind is no longer braced for impact. In the morning, I would wake still sick, still limited, but grounded in something solid. I had not regained my old strength. I had gained something else. Authority over my own life. And that, I knew, would carry me through whatever came next. The days began to blur together in a gentler way, no longer marked by dread or waiting, but by rhythm. Morning light, medication, tea, a few pages of a book, a phone call or two. I noticed how my body responded differently when my mind wasn't clenched around expectation. Pain was still there, but it no longer felt amplified by disappointment. I had stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, stopped imagining excuse others might give for not showing up. What was happening was happening. That alone brought relief. My children settled into this new arrangement unevenly. One adapted quickly, respecting my boundaries almost instinctively. Another struggled, occasionally testing limits, with comments that hinted at the old dynamic. Each time, I responded the same way, calm, brief, consistent. Over time, even the testing slowed. Boundaries, I learned, are like doors. Slammed, they invite resistance. Closed gently but firmly, they teach people where the wall is. One afternoon, I received a call from an old friend who had heard about my illness through a mutual acquaintance. She spoke with warmth, asked thoughtful questions, and listened without rushing me. After we hung up, I realized something uncomfortable. She had offered more presence in one conversation than some of my children had over months. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me honest. Love and familiarity are not the same. Obligation does not guarantee care. I began to curate my energy the way I once curated my time. I stopped answering calls when I felt depleted. I stopped agreeing to visits that left me exhausted. I framed these choices not as withdrawals, but as investments in what little strength I had. My children noticed. They began asking what worked for me instead of suggesting what should. This shift, small as it seemed, changed everything. The lawyer sent a brief check-in email, routine and impersonal. I replied with thanks and no questions. His role was complete, but his presence lingered in the structure he helped create. I thought about how differently things might have gone without that intervention, how easy it would have been to drift, to let illness decide everything by default. Instead, I had anchored myself before the current grew stronger. There was a day when I had to be hospitalized briefly after a sudden complication. It was frightening, but not chaotic. My children arrived, organized, coordinated. They spoke to doctors calmly. They deferred to my wishes when decisions were discussed. I watched them from the bed, tired but clear-headed, and realized they were behaving differently because I had taught them how. Not with lectures, but with limits. When I returned home, I felt something like pride, not in them exactly, but in myself. I had navigated vulnerability without surrendering authority. That balance is rarely taught, especially to mothers. We are taught to give until there is nothing left, then to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention remain. I had rejected that lesson quietly but firmly. As my recovery stabilized, I found myself thinking less about what I had lost and more about what I still had. Time, though uncertain, was still mine. Choice, though constrained, still existed. Relationships, though altered, were still evolving. I had assumed illness would only take. I had not expected it to clarify. One evening, as I prepared dinner slowly, my PH1 rang. My eldest asked if I needed anything. I told him no, but thanked him for asking. He said he would call tomorrow anyway. He did. The consistency mattered. Trust, I realized, is rebuilt not with intensity, but with repetition. I began to imagine a future not defined solely by decline, smaller ambitions, quieter pleasures, teaching my grandchildren without exhausting myself, writing things down while my hands were steady, choosing when to engage and when to rest. This was not resignation. It was adaptation. The illness had stripped away many illusions, but it had also revealed a sturdier truth. I did not need to be indispensable to be loved. I needed to be present, honest, and willing to insist on respect. My children were learning that lesson slowly, sometimes painfully, but they were learning. As I lay down that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, I felt no urge to check my phone. If someone needed me, they would call again. If they didn't, that was information too. Either way, I was no longer afraid of the silence. I noticed how my sense of time changed. Before, hours dragged when I waited for calls that didn't come, and weeks vanished when I was too busy compensating for others. Now time felt even, honest. Each day had weight, but it wasn't heavy. It simply existed, and so did I within it. Illness has a way of narrowing your world, but clarity expands it again, not outward, but inward. My children began to speak to me differently in front of others. There was respect in their tone, an acknowledgement they hadn't practiced before. When doctors asked questions, they looked to me first. When decisions were discussed, they paused, giving me space to answer. I realized they had learned something essential, that my illness did not erase my authority. That lesson, once learned, does not disappear easily. There were still moments of grief. Grief for the years I had lived assuming care would be automatic. Grief for the version of myself who thought endurance was the same as love. These moments arrived quietly, often when I least expected them. I let them come. I did not rush to reframe them into something positive. Grief, I discovered, moves faster when it's not resisted. One afternoon, my youngest asked if I was angry with them. The question caught me off guard. I thought before answering. I told her no, I wasn't angry. I was awake. There was a difference. She nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. We sat together without speaking for a while. The silence was not tense. It was shared. As my health allowed, I began walking short distances again. The neighborhood looked different than it had before. Familiar houses seemed sharper, more detailed. I noticed small things. The way one neighbor always watered her plants at the same time each morning, the way another waved without stopping. Life was still moving, quietly, steadily, without consulting my fears. That realization was oddly comforting. The lawyer remained a DI. Scant figure now, his role complete, but his influence lived on in the security I felt. Knowing that my wishes were documented, freed mental space I hadn't realized was occupied. I no longer rehearsed worst-case scenarios in my head. If something happened, there was a plan. Planning, I learned, is not pessimism. It is mercy, both for yourself and for those who come after. My children began asking me about my life before them, about my parents, about decisions I made when I was young. There was curiosity there, not calculation. I told them stories I hadn't told in years. Some made us laugh. Some surprised them. I realized they were seeing me not just as their mother, but as a whole person with a history that did not revolve around them. That shift felt important. There was a moment when one of them said, almost casually, "I didn't know you were so strong." I corrected him gently. I said I wasn't strong in the way he meant. I was clear. Strength suggests enduring what hurts. Clarity suggests choosing what doesn't. He thought about that for a long time. My body still set limits. Some days were better than others, but my mind no longer fought those limits. I adjusted plans without apology. I rested without guilt. I asked for help when I needed it and accepted it without debt. This balance felt new, almost radical. One evening, as I watched the light fade from the sky, I thought about how easily this could have gone differently, how close I had come to shrinking quietly, to letting illness and neglect define the end of my story. Instead, I had intervened, not with anger but with structure. That intervention had changed everything. I didn't know how much time I had left. No one ever really does. But I knew how I wanted to spend it. Present, heard, responsible for my own life. My children were learning to meet me there, some faster than others, but they were moving in the same direction. As the house settled into night, I felt a deep, steady calm, not happiness, not triumph, just rightness, the kind that comes when you stop negotiating your worth and start living as if it's already settled. There came a point when I realized I was no longer measuring my days by how much I had been needed. That metric had governed my life for decades, quietly dictating my sense of worth. When illness stripped that away, it felt like a loss at first. Now it felt like relief. I could finally experience a day without proving anything to anyone. I woke, I rested, I lived. That was enough. My children began to accept this version of me, not as a temporary adjustment, but as the new normal. They stopped apologizing excessively, stopped explaining themselves in advance. Our conversations became simpler, more direct. When they offered help, it was specific. When I declined, they accepted it. We were no longer performing roles. We were responding to reality. There was a conversation with my eldest that stayed with me. He said he had been afraid when the lawyer first called. Afraid of losing control, afraid of being excluded. I told him I understood. I said fear often masquerades as concern. He nodded slowly. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said he hadn't realized how much I had protected them from consequences when they were younger, how often I had stepped in quietly. The realization seemed to unsettle him. I didn't rush to reassure him. Some truths need space. As my strength stabilized, I began organizing my days around pleasure as much as necessity. I cooked when I could, rested when I couldn't. I listened to music in the afternoons, letting it fill the rooms. I wrote in my notebook, not plans or lists, but reflections, small truths I wanted to remember. I was no longer preparing for a crisis. I was inhabiting my life. The lawyer sent one final letter, formal and brief, confirming that all documents were securely filed and accessible when needed. I placed it in the folder without ceremony. It no longer felt like a lifeline. It felt like a foundation. Something solid beneath my feet, unnoticed most days, but always there. My children's visits became less tense. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then easier. We talked about ordinary things, movies, weather, work. The illness was no longer the center of every conversation. That shift felt healthy. It meant my life had expanded beyond survival again. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the old dynamic trying to resurface, a suggestion framed as a decision, an expectation disguised as a favor. Each time I responded calmly, redirecting the conversation without drama. Over time, those moments became rare. People adapt to the boundaries that are consistently enforced. One afternoon, I sat by the window and watched the world move without me. Cars passed, children played. A neighbor argued gently on the phone. Life was happening everywhere. Indifferent to my fears, my illness, my past. That indifference no longer felt cruel. It felt freeing. I was not required to be everything to everyone. I was allowed to be myself. My youngest asked if I regretted anything. The question lingered between us. I thought carefully before answering. I said I regretted waiting so long to speak clearly. I regretted confusing endurance with love, but I did not regret the life I had lived, every pattern I had broken, I had once helped build. Understanding that allowed me to forgive myself. As the days grew quieter, I felt an unexpected sense of gratitude, not for the illness, but for what it revealed. It had stripped away pretense, exposed habits that no longer served me, and forced me to choose myself without apology. That choice had changed not only my life, but my relationships. One evening, as I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a message from my eldest. He thanked me, not for money, not for help, but for being clear. He said it had changed how he thought about responsibility. I read the message twice, then set the phone down. I did not reply immediately. Some words deserved to settle before being answered. I lay down, listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The illness was still there. The future was still uncertain, but I felt grounded in a way I never had before. I had stopped waiting for rescue. I had built something steadier instead. As sleep approached, I thought about the moment on the kitchen floor when this all began. How invisible I had felt, how alone. That version of me felt distant now, not erased, but transformed. I had not been saved by a dramatic gesture or a sudden apology. I had been saved by clarity, by structure, and by the quiet courage to stop disappearing. The world did not suddenly become kinder, but it became clearer, and clarity proved more valuable than comfort. I noticed how often people confuse peace with passivity. I had once done the same. Now I understood peace as alignment, the quiet satisfaction of living according to what is true rather than what is expected. My days reflected that understanding. They were simpler, yes, but also richer in a way that surprised me. My children stopped asking if I was okay in the anxious tone that seeks reassurance more than truth. They asked how I was, and they listened. When I said I was tired, they didn't rush to fix it. They let it be. That change alone made my fatigue easier to carry. I realized how much energy I had spent in the past managing other people's reactions to my reality. Without that burden, I had more left for myself. There were conversations that felt overdue by decades, not dramatic confessions, but honest acknowledgments. One of my children admitted they had assumed I would always manage, always adapt. I told them I had encouraged that belief. We sat with that mutual responsibility without assigning blame. Blame, I had learned, rarely builds anything lasting. The lawyer faded completely from my daily thoughts, but his role remained significant in hindsight. He had been the external voice that validated what I had begun to sense internally, that I was allowed to assert myself, that my wishes mattered, that planning was not pessimism but care. Without that intervention, I might have continued shrinking, mistaking patience for virtue. As the seasons shifted, my health followed its own unpredictable rhythm. Some weeks were gentle, others were not. I stopped trying to forecast how I would feel and focused instead on responding to each day as it arrived. This approach reduced my anxiety more than any reassurance ever had. I learned to trust myself to handle what came, even when I didn't know what that would be. My children began to include me in their lives in ways that felt mutual rather than obligatory. They shared challenges without expecting me to solve them. They asked for perspective, not rescue. This shift allowed me to engage without depletion. I could offer what I had, not what I didn't. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, my eldest said something quietly. He said he was glad. Dee, the lawyer, had called. The admission surprised him as much as it surprised me. He said it had forced him to confront assumptions he didn't know he was making. He said it had changed how he thought about responsibility, not just toward me, but toward his own children. I listened, absorbing the weight of that realization. Change, I understood then, rarely travels in straight lines, but it does ripple outward. There were moments when I felt a pang of sadness for what could have been different sooner. I let those moments pass without judgment. Regret, when examined honestly, often points toward growth rather than failure. I chose to see it that way. As my days grew quieter, I found joy in small routines. Morning light through the window, the sound of the kettle, the feel of paper beneath my pen. These details grounded me in the present. I was no longer rushing toward a future shaped by fear or clinging to a past defined by sacrifice. I was inhabiting the space I had. My children adapted fully to this new equilibrium. They no longer hovered or withdrew. They showed up consistently and respectfully. The relationship felt adult on both sides, balanced. I had not demanded this change. I had modeled it. One night, as I prepared for sleep, I thought again of the moment on the kitchen floor, the blinking clock, the silence. That moment no longer haunted me. It had become a marker, a point of departure rather than an ending. From there, everything had shifted, not because others had changed first, but because I turned off the light, feeling the steady presence of my own breath. Whatever time remained, I would live it without disappearing. That promise felt enough. The last thing that changed was the way I spoke to myself. It happened quietly, without ceremony, the way most real changes do. I stopped using the language of endurance and started using the language of choice. Instead of saying I had to get through the day, I said I would move through it. Instead of asking how much I could tolerate, I asked what felt right. These were small shifts, but they altered everything that followed. My children noticed it before I mentioned it. They commented that I seemed calmer, more certain. One of them asked how I did it, how I stayed so steady when my body was unpredictable and my future uncertain. I told them the truth. I said I stopped arguing with reality and started arranging my life around it. Resistance, I explained, had cost me more energy than illness ever did. There were fewer visits now, but they were better. When my children came, they came present, not hurried or distracted. They asked before offering advice. They waited before responding. Sometimes we sat together without talking, and no one rushed to fill the space. Silence had become something we shared, not something we feared. I thought often about how easily I could have disappeared inside this illness, how common it is for people, especially women, especially mothers, to become invisible once they are no longer useful in the same way. I had felt that invisibility sharply at first. Now I understood it differently. I had not been erased. I had stepped aside. And stepping back in required clarity, not permission. One afternoon, I opened the folder with my documents again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see them with new eyes. They no longer felt like protection against my children. They felt like protection for myself. A statement that my life, in whatever form it took, mattered enough to be respected. My health remained uncertain. There were days I moved slowly, carefully, conserving strength. There were days I felt almost like my old self. I no longer chased the good days or feared the bad ones. Each day arrived, and I met it where it was. That acceptance did not make me passive. It made me precise. The calls from my children came regularly now, not driven by fear or obligation. When they asked how I was, they waited for the real answer. When I said I needed rest, they understood it wasn't rejection. When I said I wanted company, they showed up. The balance felt natural. Finally, one evening, my eldest thanked me again. This time, he said the changes I made had altered how he thought about care, about responsibility, about respect. He said he was trying to apply the same clarity in his own life. I listened, grateful but cautious. Growth, I knew, unfolds at its own pace. Still, hearing it mattered. As the months passed, I felt less defined by what had happened and more by what was happening now. I cooked simple meals. I wrote in my notebook. I watched the light change on the walls. These ordinary moments grounded me more than any reassurance ever had. I was no longer waiting for validation. I was living inside my own approval. When I thought back to the beginning, to the kitchen floor and the unanswered messages, the memory no longer carried shame. It carried information. It showed me where my life had been misaligned. Correcting that misalignment had required courage, not confrontation, structure, not drama. The lawyer's call had been the catalyst, but the decision to stop disappearing had been mine. I did not know what the future would hold. Illness does not provide timelines, but I knew how I would meet it, present, clear, unapologetic about my needs, open to connection, but no longer dependent on it for my worth. That night, as I turned off the light, I felt something settle deep inside me. Not relief, not triumph, ownership of my time, my voice, my life. Whatever came next, I would meet it whole,